Today we're going to do some reading with the cat. You'll hear some of the purring, and I will read from a book that I just started reading. It is a book by, what's his name? About this book, Corey Franklin, Cook County ICU, 30 years of unforgettable patients and odd cases. Has 4 stars out of 5 rating. So, I just started reading it, and somebody's sleeping with me here, purring, and we're going to continue reading it. Okay. Once a student of mine, an especially earnest one, wanted to impress me, so I gave him a difficult assignment to draw blood from a hardened gang member. It was challenging because we needed to draw from an artery to test the oxygen level in the patient's blood, which a routine blood draw from a bay does not provide. It was a test of the student's skill. The assignment was to draw blood at the patient's wrist from the artery where you take your pulse. The artery is so close, it's close to the bone, so if the needle misses the artery and hits the bone, it can be quite painful, and it's not a good idea to inflict the unnecessary pain on a gang member, especially when you're a student. He went to draw the blood from the patient's artery, and it took 15 long minutes. It must have been agony for the patient and a different type of agony for the student. When the 15 minutes were over, he had a sample from the patient, but unfortunately he had missed the artery and the blood sample was from a nearby vein, useless for the information we needed. The student was disconsolate. Disconsolate? No, how do you pronounce that? Disconsolate, yes, without consolation. Unaccustomed to failure in his academic career, he came to me knowing that he had failed and was worried that he had let me down. Besides that, we still didn't have the sample we needed. I reassured him, told him how difficult obtaining those samples was, and said we could still get an arterial sample. He told me there was no way the patient would let me try another needle stick. The last 5 minutes I was trying to draw it, he was staring me down. I don't think he will let anyone draw his blood now. I said, don't worry, I will draw his blood. Come on, I'll take you with me. But what are you going to tell him? Watch. We went to the patient's room, and as predicted, he gave us a nasty glare. His right wrist was extremely sore from the unsuccessful blood draw. Man, what you guys want? He suspected We were there to draw blood again. I have to take another sample, Andrew. Hey, he already drew my blood. What you need more blood for? The student was visibly nervous. He thought I was going to tell the patient he had made a mistake by getting an erroneous sample. It would be devastating to the student's already shaky confidence. Andrew, he got the sample from your right wrist. We saw the results. But we have to draw a sample from your left wrist to compare it with the one from your right. I know that one was painful, but don't worry, I'll draw this one. We have to see if the right and left blood are the same or different. Of course, there is no difference between blood drawn from the left arm and the right arm. Same blood. But I gambled that Andrew didn't realize that. He gave me a suspicious look, considered the problem a minute, and said, "Okay, Doc, go ahead." I drew the blood from the artery on his left wrist quickly and painlessly. "Thanks, Andrew." "No problem, Doc." Andrew nodded approvingly at me and then at the student. The gang member was actually happy. He could be cooperative. He was satisfied. The student was relieved, and I had the necessary sample. The student thanked me for rescuing him. He went on to become one of the country's top physicians in his field, far eclipsing me and my career. I wonder if he ever tells his students that story. One of the final indignities of medical school is the interview for residency positions in the student's senior year. This is not always an unpleasant experience because some hospitals want to attract the best students and thus treat them well during interviews. But in my case, coming as a student from Chicago and interviewing in the highly competitive atmosphere of New York hospitals, I was forced to run the gauntlet. Manhattan has some of the best hospitals in the United States, and it is a wonderful place to live when you're young and single. So I had decided to interview there for my residency, New York, New York. Even for a medical student, if you can make it there. It was right before Christmas. In Chicago, Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, has just died. Chicago was grieving as I caught the early flight to LaGuardia on a cold winter morning, greeted by a frigid wind whipping around the right angles of the downtown Manhattan skyscrapers. The morning of my first interview, I hailed a cab to St. Vincent's in Greenwich Village, a once legendary hospital. The legacy of St. Vincent's has faded, but in its day it was quite a grand place. One that recalled a different, more glorious era of medicine. Founded in 1849 with a mission to care for the poor and disenfranchised, it was world-renowned for its care. The poet Edna Street Vincent Millay was named after the hospital. How many famous poets have been named after hospitals? Unfortunately, several years ago, after 163 years in business, the hospital closed unceremoniously, a victim of medicine's changing business environment. But when I interviewed there in 1970s, St. Vincent's was still a vibrant place. The intensive care unit was among the country's finest, and the hospital, which turned no one away, took care of the widest variety of patients. Bohemians from the village, the poet Dylan Thomas died there after a legendary bender. Alcoholics from the Bowery, high-level professionals from the financial district, and Chinese immigrants from Chinatown. Nobody knew it then. Somebody is stretching here. Nobody knew it then, but St. Vincent's would soon become one of the major AIDS hospitals in the world. An ironic coincidence for a hospital that celebrated its strict Roman Catholic heritage. The morning of my interview, I was sent to a basement cafeteria and told to wait there. I got a cup of coffee and sat down with a number of students from New York medical schools. It seemed they all were interviewing at the same hospitals and all knew each other. I was the nervous outsider listening closely to the gossip about the pluses and minuses of the New York hospitals. I was completely ignored until one of the students unexpectedly turned to me and asked in a thick Long Island accent, "So where are you from?" "I'm from Chicago," I answered in my flat, Midwestern tone. "Oh, University of Chicago?" "No, actually, I'm from Northwestern." This was my first taste of New York City provincialism. In those days, the common belief was that if you were from Chicago, you had to be from the University of Chicago. There were simply no other universities there. What? Are you getting hot? What's happening? Stole? He's sitting on a heating pad, so that's why he came to lie down. Okay. Saul Steinberg's famous New Yorker cover, View of the World from Ninth Avenue, is not without some basis. The student looked aghast and proceeded to give me a geography lesson about exactly where my university was located. Northwestern is not Chicago, or it's in Ohio. One of his colleagues, looking to correct him, located Northwestern in the Great Northwest. No, Northwestern is not in Ohio, it's in Washington. Thankfully, a resident with a slightly more refined Manhattan accent rescued me for that moment. "You can come with me, I'm going to give you a tour." A tour of the hospital, which I considered a pleasant gesture. How thoughtful. It was still early about 8 a.m., and I figured my interview wouldn't be until at least 9. I relaxed a bit, opened the buttons on my sport jacket, and popped a stick of gum into my mouth chewing unobtrusively while the student led on. It was a mistake. For the next 10 minutes, the resident was sullen and rude. He didn't want to be there and answered no questions. But I found the hospital to be beautiful, immaculate, and charming in its dotage. It was certainly cleaner than some of the new Soviet-style hospitals at which I had interviewed. The hospital was festooned with Christmas decorations. A crucifix hung in every room, and there were reminders everywhere of the proud Catholic tradition of the Sisters of Charity who had founded the hospital more than a century before. You don't see that much in hospitals anymore. It is a grand tradition, all but gone from American medicine, never to return. At the same time, I also sensed a real passion for patient care and quite a degree of medical sophistication and professionalism. Passion, sophistication, and professionalism with a tinge of rudeness. It's Manhattan. Even to a non-Catholic like me, the hospital was an extremely impressive place, and I saw why it had the reputation it did. I thought I would be proud to work here. No chance of that happening. About 10 minutes into the tour, the door resident brought me to a room and shoved me with no warning. It was my interview, unannounced. The chief of medicine at St. Vincent's for many years was Dr. William Grace, the elderly Shire. See what that is. What's all this movement? What, you want to leave? You done? You're getting hot. What do you think? Definitely doing something. Okay, this is definitely not going to work. That's okay. That's him purring. Definitely likes it. Okay. So he's going to an interview with his doctor. He was a pioneer in cardiac care and treatment for myocardial infarction. And most notably, he founded the first mobile coronary care unit in America. Basically a white or red Chevy van with monitoring and resuscitation equipment capable of defibrillation. It could answer calls over a wide area of lower Manhattan. While new routine, it was a revolutionary concept in the 1960s. It's a pity that Dr. Grace is not better known today. He was a legend in his time, and he was one of the reasons I wanted to be at St. Vincent's. At that moment, he was sitting right in front of me. To say the least, it was unanticipated and intimidating. They say you don't want to meet your heroes because you'll be disappointed in them. In this case, it was the exact opposite. Flanked on each side by 3 nuns, he measured me up before I had time to swallow my gum and button my jacket. I certainly disappointed them. It happened that Dr. Grace interviewed nearly every residency candidate personally. He died shortly after my interview, so I had the distinction of being one of the final candidates he ever interviewed. I think I also earned the distinction of having the shortest interview of all time. He didn't even ask me to sit down. Since there was a chair in front of him, presumably meant for residency candidate interviews, I took that as a bad sign. He looked down at my resume. I see you're from Chicago. That's right, sir. That was the high point. Everything went downhill from there. The nuns, who probably noticed I had been chewing gum, glared at me disapprovingly. They must have been wondering if there was a spare rule around with which to wrap my knuckles, or at the very least a couple of erasers for me to pound together after the interview. Dr. Grace never looked up at me. He asked me 1 or 2 perfunctory questions and dismissed me summarily. Total interview time 4 minutes. I may have wanted St. Vincent's, but it was pretty obvious that St. Vincent's didn't want me. There were still 2 other New York hospitals where I could interview that weekend. Columbia Presbyterian was different from Vincent's. It was and is one of the leading university medical centers in the country. Prestigious doctors everywhere you turn. In truth, though, it was not as clean as St. Vincent's. In my journey to and from Columbia Presbyterian, there was one incident I considered a potential omen. The hospital is on the north end of Manhattan, and my cab took the west side highway uptown. On the way there, I saw a nice, late model car stalled on the side of the highway, no driver. I didn't think much of it, but this was New York in the 1970s. It was a different place from today, with a much rougher age. My tour and subsequent hospital interview took about 2 hours. I knew I was not the top of their list. The university hospitals in New York got a tremendous number of applicants and had a preference for students from New York medical schools. After a short, unpromising interview, I was escorted to the hospital lobby, where I called a cab to head back to Midtown. The cab retraced the route on the west side highway. There, in the exact same spot, was the same late model car I had seen abandoned a couple of hours before, now completely stripped, including the tires, quite possibly a sign that New York wasn't for me. My final interview was at Mount Sinai, located on the posh Upper East Side, to the south of the most affluent residential areas in the United States. To the north, Harlem is the site of some of the poorest neighborhoods in America. Mount Sinai is nearly as old as St. Vincent's, but is in no danger of closing. Its list of benefactors includes some of the country's wealthiest and most prestigious individuals, such as Wall Street power brokers Carl Icahn and Henry Kravis. This is reflected everywhere in the hospital. Mount Sinai is beautiful, with long corridors and stunning hallways that feature its list of impressive donors. It was the first hospital designed by I.M. Pei. The clinical research at Mount Sinai has always been among the best in the country. It is the hospital where Crohn's disease and many other ailments were first described. My chances of becoming a resident there were not good to begin with. The hospital had started its own medical school several years before and gave its students preference for residency. Besides that, I lacked the desired research background, but I had applied there and gotten an interview, so it was worth a shot. Not for long. I was given an obligatory brief tour of the hospital by another resident who was not interested in spending more than a moment with me. At least this one told me my interview would be coming up. He took me to a beautiful paneled room with a long walnut table and left me there. No one else was in the room, and I waited alone for about half an hour. Finally, an attending physician walked in, briefly introduced himself, and sat at the other end of the table. I suspected the distance between us was not an accident. He was smooth, with an air of enforced formality in his manner, and more than a hint of imperiousness in his voice. For medical students from Chicago, Mount Sinai was not a place to be trifled with. His first question was the same as the other two hospitals, whether I was from Chicago. This was the one thing that had stood out in my folder in all three places. Unlike the other Manhattan hospitals, this time I was able to elaborate on my answer with what I thought would be a point in my favor. Yes, my father worked very closely for years with Hans Popper. Dr. Popper was a world-renowned Austrian river specialist who fled with the Nazis right before World War II and came to Chicago. My father worked with him at Cook County for many years before Popper left for New York, where he was named the chief pathologist at Mount Sinai. He was instrumental in founding the Mount Sinai School of Medicine and was appointed its first dean. Sometimes that kind of connection helps. I thought it might impress my interviewer. It didn't. In fact, it barely registered. My father had offered to call Popper to help me secure a position there, but I told him not to because I wanted to earn it on my own. But when that got me to no points, I had nothing to fall back on. I started wondering if I could get an earlier flight back to Chicago. His final question was one that I had not been asked before. How do you treat pulmonary edema? Occasionally in interviews, doctors will ask students clinical questions as a way to ascertain how much the student really knows. Not every interviewer did it then, but today it is almost standard operating procedures. The practice never made sense to me because every good student knows the basics of treating pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, but no student has the actual experience to give more than a superficial answer. It wasn't like physics, where a good answer to a theoretical question might let you pick out the really brilliant student who may have a special gift. Medicine doesn't work like that. Others disagree, but I always felt that resorting to this type of question took away from what the interviewer really wanted to learn about the candidate: personality, character, interests, what type of resident he or she might be. Years later, when I interview candidates, I never once asked a clinical question. I felt it would be demeaning to the candidate who in truth was applying to learn the exact thing you were asking him if he knew. Back at Mount Sinai, I was quite capable of giving my interviewer an acceptable response, one that could pass an exam. I had treated enough patients with pulmonary edema to give him the superficial answer that you can get from reading a book, but I saw the question as a sign he was reinforcing the distance, literal and metaphorical, between us, letting me know my place, and it wasn't Mount Sinai. But in a sense, the question was liberating. The long day, quick tours, the stripped car, the paneled room, the walnut table, the dismissive attitude, and now this. I knew I didn't belong, and he knew I didn't belong. I gave him an answer I was pretty sure he had never heard before, and probably has not heard since. I guess if I knew how to treat pulmonary edema, I wouldn't be sitting here applying to learn how to treat it. Like the medical student from New York and Chicago in the Chicago operating room who held a retractor, I would have perhaps been better served holding my tongue. All of us say things we wish we had held back, and I have said more than my share, but this was not one of those times. My answer was undoubtedly disrespectful. But as Bob Dylan once said, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. And on that winter day on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, I had nothing and nothing to lose. Somebody's stretching here. I wasn't going to be accepted even if I were the world's expert on pulmonary edema. He definitely wasn't expecting that answer. Caught off guard, his jaw dropped slightly, and his preternatural, preternatural, what? I don't know what that word means. Come on, Kindle. So beyond what's normal and natural. Preternatural. Okay. Calm was shattered for a brief moment. Then he regained the poise I'm sure he demonstrated in every meeting. He brusquely closed my file. Well, I think we're done. End of interview. The medical student from Chicago left I don't know this word either. There's no, looks like Kindle can't give me an answer either. No definition. Bludgeonings of New York. Had bloodied and slightly bowed. I never heard back from any of the 3 residency programs. Just another student in dignity on the road to becoming a doctor. Well, somebody's definitely stretched out here. And I think we're ready to go to bed. Don't know which part of bed I'm going to occupy, but he's right in the middle. I hope you enjoyed this interaction, this reading, and watching him as well. Until next time, take care of yourself and be well. Goodbye.